Before we dive into today's episode, we felt it necessary to put in a trigger warning. We discussed the tragic story of how Steve's son Jordan died by suicide a few years ago, and we also discussed the depths and complexities of this tragic epidemic. If you or someone you know is having suicidal thoughts or ideation, please contact the Samaritans or go to our show notes where we will be putting other resources to assist you. This is a very progressive conversation and one that might just save a life, so I have a request. Please listen to it and help us share Steve's powerful message and honour his wonderful son. Rest in peace, Jordan.
When I look back at that call, it was logged for 2 minutes. I remember probably about the first 20 seconds of the call. Charlotte, just in absolute distress, just kept saying the words, I'm sorry, it's Jordan, he's killed himself. This is definitely one of the common areas that people have reached such a thought process that they believe that people would be better off without them, that they are a burden. We know, as families left behind, that is not right at all, because the impact and the devastation and the ripple effect afterwards is far worse than whatever that person considers themselves in terms of being a burden. Knowing what I know now, it drives me, because if I can prevent someone else from taking their own life, then that's important to me, because, well, I wasn't able to do it for Jordan.
Steve, there are certain stories that you see on the internet that really hit you. And when I saw your post on LinkedIn a number of months ago, it really stopped me in my tracks for many reasons. And I do want to get into that and why we are here today. But I also want to know more about you, because before this event happened, you were doing coaching and speaking. Is that right?
Yeah, my career, I've been a bit of a wanderer probably since I left school. Several years in hotel and catering industry, then some 20-odd years in the automotive sector in the UK and Canada, running car dealerships, and then found my way into the world of consultancy in around about 2000, that kind of period. And more recently, having spent time in leadership and management coaching and development, I set up my own coaching practice, and that very quickly moved into coaching businesses of all shapes and sizes how to use social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, which used to confuse a lot of people who booked me initially because they expected some young millennial to walk in, and they got this balding, aged guy turned up. But yeah, for 11 and a half years, from really 2009, thereabouts, 2008 to 2019, the end of that year, social media was my area of kind of expertise. I delivered talks around the country and overseas on that topic.
I personally think that everyone should go through hospitality in some capacity. They have to do, I don't know, like 3 months worth of working there to really understand the stresses and pressures that people go under. Because I was in the industry for 15 years as well. What were some of the things that were transferable, do you feel, from hospitality to running a coaching business and helping people there?
I just think people learning to, I lived and worked in hotels in the Lake District in the UK and became restaurant manager of one of the bigger, what was Trust House 40 hotels there at the time. And I think the thing for me was that you'd have your lunch, you'd have your breakfast, you have your evening meal in the staff canteen, and you'd be sitting with the head receptionist, maybe an assistant manager, the guy from pot wash, you're kind of all in it together. There was no real hierarchy. And I think that was one of the great things about that industry was just this ability to get to know people, their backgrounds, and it wasn't such, this department's higher than another department. You kind of all mucked in together, all went for a beer together. So I think it's socializing and understanding people. That industry was a great grounding for me, really.
Yeah, because it's a lot of psychology, isn't there, involved in hospitality, because you're always watching You have to have your head on a swivel. Anything could happen at any moment. You have to be risk averse, and seeing if people are shivering too much, it means it's too cold. If they're sweating, it means it's too hot. If they're doing that and they're talking, it's obviously too loud, etc., etc. But I think that, as you said, it's just transferable to just about anything. Because when I transitioned from hospitality to coaching, some people were just so confused by it. I was like, well, I've managed large businesses, high volume, stress, pressure, people management, sales ability, marketing. It's all relevant, right? Especially when you want to start your own business. So, take me back to December the 4th, 2019, and how that day changed your life forever.
Yeah, well, interestingly, we talked about the work I was doing in social media. That day, I was actually in the Midlands, in Solihull. I'd been working with International Motors Group, their management team, and I was running a Facebook workshop for them that day. I have to say, out of all the platforms, Facebook was the one I felt less comfortable with. I mean, there's so many facets to it to trying to keep up to speed with, and things change rapidly. So I knew I'd been stressing out about this workshop. I was up quite late the night before, finalising it still and getting it prepared. So that was my stress. That was my worry that day. But I delivered that workshop during the course of the day on December the 4th, and it had gone really well. So I kind of left that session, said my farewells, was on a high, walked out of the building, said cheerio to the receptionist there, and got into my car. And as I was just putting my seatbelt on, put the phone into the holder onto the dashboard, I got an incoming call on the screen. It was from Charlotte, Jordan's girlfriend. Not unusual maybe for her to call, but she wouldn't call regularly, maybe WhatsApp messages or texts. And that was the moment that really just changed my life completely, because when I look back at that call, it was logged for 2 minutes. I remember probably about the first 20 seconds of the call. Charlotte, just in absolute distress, just kept saying the words, I'm sorry, it's Jordan, he's killed himself. And in that moment, just everything that you knew or thought you were going to do with your life and everything just collapsed. I've no idea how I responded. I've no idea what I said. I've no idea what we said during the remaining kind of 1.5 minutes plus of that conversation. I just remember saying, okay, are you okay? I'll call you back. Whatever I said, I've no idea at all. And then I think I just sat there for I don't know what length of time trying to work out what the hell I was supposed to do next, really.
Because I can't even fathom that level of pain, especially how it was delivered. I don't think there's any good way to deliver that news, right? So I'm not saying that as a criticism, but just as a observation that when you replay the story in your mind now, are there any of the feelings that show up that they did on the day it happened too? Or are you more at peace with what's happened now? Yeah,
it's very difficult to know what the feelings were. There was utter confusion. We talk about pain. I don't recall pain in terms of how we might be referring to that. I just know that I sat there, and then the decision I made was to go, for some reason, back into the building, because I was about to drive home, 3.5-hour drive home to Harrogate from Solihull. So my instinct told me to get out and go back into where I'd just come from. And as I walked in, the receptionist I'd just seen, I said cheerio to probably about 15 minutes earlier, was there, big smile on her face, looked a little puzzled why I was back. Then I think she just took one look at my face, and her face changed. She knew something had happened. I remember, I must have told her the call I just had. And immediately my contacts there, they came down, took me into a medical room and kind of looked after me for the next whatever period of time. And, I remember saying, right, well, I need to drive home now. And they said, well, you can't be in any fit state. We'll get a driver. We'll send a driver with you. They can get the train back. And in my head, I went into a very male practical mode, I think. And my first thought was, I can't have some poor sod sitting next to me for 3.5 hours in a car that's going to have to listen to all the hands-free calls I'm going to have to make and whatever state I'm going to be in. I can't put anyone through that, which is a strange kind of logic maybe. And I said, no, I'll be absolutely fine. And yeah, some time afterwards, maybe an hour afterwards, I got in the car and made that drive home.
Do you think there's something that's deeply wired in us as a species to just be very pragmatic, no matter what the scenario is? Or have you found through the work that you've done since that the response is vastly different?
I think it is vastly different. I think, it's been interesting to look at how maybe I'm wired and how I've dealt with it. I constantly hear people say about the work we're doing, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you've coped. And I don't look at it that way, really. What I do now is important. It's become my work, my vocation now. It's what I do. And no matter how stressful that might be in terms of the issues we're dealing with, it's what I do now. So in that way, I've become very pragmatic about the job that I do, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But I think for me, it probably is hardwired into me to have responded in the way I did do. But I know people who've been through similar experiences who have not been able to deal with it in anywhere near that kind of way.
Yeah, because I read one of your articles last night to refresh myself, and you mentioned in the article that was so wonderfully written that everyone grieves differently. Have you found your grieving process to have changed over time?
No, I'm not sure whether it has or not. Grief is an interesting thing because I don't know whether I've grieved in the traditional sense, because I was very quickly having to deal, I suppose, in the beginning with all the things you've got to deal with when something like this happens, the very practical, the pragmatic things. Jordan had his own house. He had finances and bank accounts and accounts with utilities, all those kind of things that had to be dealt with. And I probably set myself and put myself in the position as being the person who would deal with all this, and from the family's point of view, deal with all the things like the funeral arrangements, the police, the coroner, all those kind of things, the funeral home, all those things. I kind of took it on myself. I felt I was the person that should be doing that. That's probably a very male trait as well, isn't it? So I didn't go through a grieving process right at the beginning in that way. I suffered trauma. I know, and although never formally diagnosed, I recognise now that those were probably symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. That was violent shaking of the body. And, I remember the times in bed where my wife would have to literally hold me down on the bed. The shaking was so violent, or I'd be standing in the kitchen and it was like someone had punched me in the midriff. I'd literally be knocked physically backwards by whatever that was. So I recognise that probably as symptoms of PTSD. So I was dealing with trauma. There's no question about that. But in all other respects, I kind of cracked on, to use a very male term probably. That then led to the publishing of the article that you mentioned. That got a huge response globally. And it started for the first time to get me to ask questions of this audience that had responded online. I wanted to know why my son had taken his own life. I wanted to understand suicide. These were subjects I knew nothing about. And in retrospect, when you look back, you think, well, hang about, Steve, you had a son that was clinically diagnosed with anxiety and depression some 4.5 years earlier. Was this not even a consideration for you? And it wasn't. And I've asked myself that question. Well, why wasn't it? Why did I not consider there might be a risk of suicide, or just what impact his mental health was having on Jordan? And I think it's one of those things where I was busy with life. Jordan was an adult. He was 34, had his own job and life. And as long as we touched base and he told me he was doing all right, then I thought he was doing all right. I would get calls from his mother. His mother and I separated and divorced back in 2005, but we kept a close relationship. I've since got remarried, and both Jordan's mother and his stepmother have a really close relationship and get on really well, which is fantastic. But she would call on occasions, and just for context here, she'd worked as a senior mental health nurse for more than 20 years. She would say, I'm a bit worried about Jordan. And I said, okay, well, he seemed all right last time I spoke to him. I'll give him a call. So I give him a call and we'd have a chat and he'd tell me work was a bit rubbish or things were not brilliant. But generally, if I asked him how he was, he'd say he was fine. I now know, with all that I've learned in that time, that 99% of the time, someone who's struggling with their mental health, if you ask them how you're doing, they're going to tell you they're fine. But I had, as I often say now, a toolkit of understanding about mental health and suicide that was pretty rubbish. It was not a good toolkit. My toolkit now is very different.
The commonality I've seen with a lot of people that are forward thinking around this and have gone on to do great things. They've done charity work, set up foundations, run marathons in the name of parents or partners or children that may have passed through dying by suicide or perhaps cancer or what have you, is that although the pain was unbearable and unfathomable, they've recycled that pain almost to go on and do good things. And there's a lot of other people that will go a very different way. So in those early days, rather than just, I know that you referred to there, just getting stuff done and getting on it and focusing, where do you think that came from, that sort of drive to say, I'm not going to let this define me and I want to create a legacy for Jordan?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I've referred to the fact in other articles that I've written that, I recognised very early on I had a choice, really. There was two choices. One, I could sit on the sofa with a bottle, and that was quite a strong urge at that time. Just give up with everything. I failed as a parent. I should have been more alert to what was going on. Shouldn't have been so busy. All those questions and blame and guilt are a huge part of the process. When you lose somebody, particularly by suicide, those responses are quite different to any other form of grief. I made the other choice that I had to just get up and get on with things. And quite often I hear from people, particularly parents that have lost children to suicide, and they say, how do you carry on? How can we carry on? And the one thing I say is that your grief will be completely different to mine. I don't know your circumstances, who you are, your character, or anything. I said, but I know there is one common theme, and that is that you need a sense of purpose. And that sense of purpose might be, today I'm going to get out of bed and go downstairs and make myself some lunch or breakfast or a cup of coffee, because I've been in my bed, as I've heard from some people, for weeks, months. I'm going to do that. I might just go out for a walk. I might go for a run. Whatever it might be, it doesn't have to be setting up a charity or doing a marathon or anything like that, but you need some sense of purpose that says, today I'm going to do this. And I think that's what it was for me, really, Adam. It was a case of, right, today I'm going to get up and do this, and having something to do and having that sense of purpose allowed me to continue one step in front of the other. And I probably haven't stopped walking since that day, really.
That's absolutely nail on the head, and in a very, very, very different way. When people retire, they lose all sense of purpose, and people think that's the goal, is to stop. When in actual fact, it's not. It's to keep going. It's to keep progressing, because progress equals happiness, right? You have to keep moving forward regardless. And we're going back to the point there that you didn't really feel like you had a choice, but you must have been communicating to yourself every day in a much more forward-thinking way than the other, Joe Blogs that have gone through a similar situation, right? So I just find that fascinating, how person number one can set up a foundation, inspire others across the world. Person number two doesn't get out of bed. And it's not to judge that person that can't get out of bed at all, right? But I personally do a lot of work with clients around mindset and how you talk to yourself and stuff like that. So what were some of those messages that you were sending to yourself or saying out loud every single day to get by?
Yeah, I'd love to think I was that intelligent that I had some forward-thinking messages. But I don't know if I did. When I look back, I think it was literally a case of, today I know I must do this, so I will do it. And I just think just the process of keep moving forward, taking it a step at a time, helped me continue to do that. And I can't remember I think the lady's name who came up with this concept or this term, but there's a term known as post-traumatic growth that's talked about a lot. And it is just this situation where someone's experienced, hugely traumatic event, but out of that, they grow and go on to do quite incredible things. So it's actually a term now that's used quite a lot. So I think I've experienced post-traumatic growth as a result of that, but not with any defined plan. I don't think. I think it was literally a case of just moving forward, being curious, wanting to know why my son had taken his own life. And as I started to learn more, because one of the things in the early days, as I started to read books and connect with people on LinkedIn and have these conversations, in the very early days, my understanding of suicide was that it was a mental health illness. So I would be using and having conversations saying, Jordan had an illness of the mind. But then as I started to explore suicide in more depth and become better educated, I realized that that's just one small part of the issue. What is it that's led someone to have a mental illness of the mind, call it anxiety, depression, PTSD, whatever it might be. And what I've learned is it's very multifaceted. It's very, very complex. It's the history of that person's life from childhood and what they might have experienced, a sense of losses along the way, their environment, their biological makeup, some maybe hereditary experiences within the family, the environment that they are existing within, the cost of living, for example, crisis hitting many people very hard at the moment. So as time went on, my curiosity just developed. So this is why I say that I've just kept walking, really just kept going forward. And as I've learned more, and I think what that's done for me, and I've never really sat down and considered this, but just talking about it now, is I think that understanding has helped me to process much better. I used to say that what I was doing was a distraction technique, maybe, and maybe one day I'll just collapse and fall in a heap. I don't believe that will happen to me now. It's not to say it won't. At some point where the whole enormity of it just descends upon me, and we're recording this in late November or mid-November, where we're coming very close to the 5th anniversary, and this time is always a very jittery time for us. We don't like it for obvious reasons, but I don't see a time where I will have that complete collapse, because I think by understanding why my son might have taken his own life, not in that moment, what led him to take the action on that morning of December the 4th, but what he was going through, that understanding has helped me, I think, process and deal with grief, if we want to call it that, really, and to be able to continue to do the work that I do now.
Like I said, mate, it's extremely admirable to have gone through it and to want to serve others, not only for your own benefit of getting the purpose, I need something to get out of bed for, but to use that as an act of service to go around the world and spread the message, I think is one of the biggest sign of strength that we have within us as people, right?
It's strange because, in an odd way, that isn't how I see it. It's strange. I hear, I've seen many comments from people saying, what you're doing is admirable. You're really brave. Brave is a word that's used a lot. And most of us, I think, that work in the suicide prevention space with lived experience don't like that word because we don't see ourselves as being brave necessarily. And we're also very conscious that if you've got to be brave to do this, someone who isn't feeling brave might say, well, I'm not a brave person. I don't feel brave, therefore I can't do.
And my message isn't as powerful, perhaps, or isn't as good, right?
So vulnerability is a word that's used a lot, being willing to show your vulnerability and being open, particularly as a male. I think that a lot of people have resonated with that. And I'm kind of okay with that because I am prepared to show the vulnerable side of me. Am I brave? I don't think so. I'm doing what I do. Is what I do admirable? If other people feel it's that, that's great as well. For me, if I look and say, what is my drive? It is the fact that I know now that most suicides are preventable. All the research and evidence shows us that. I know that particularly at that time, Jordan's suicide was potentially preventable. Not to say that he wouldn't have made another attempt at some other point and things would have got too much for him. But knowing what I know now, it drives me, because if I can prevent someone else from taking their own life, then that's important to me, because, well, I wasn't able to do it for Jordan.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably what drives me more than anything.
Do you judge yourself for what happened?
I've dealt with that, I think, reasonably well. I think you do go through, as I said earlier, the blame and the questions. But I think I come back to what I said before, that, I had a particularly poor set of tools to equip me to know how to deal with this. And it wasn't necessarily my fault either. Yes, I could have learned more. I could have made an effort, I think, to understand more about mental health and depression and anxiety. And a lot of people would quite rightly say, well, why didn't you make the effort? And I will just simply say, I probably got too busy with my own life. And as long as Jordan told me he was okay, he was okay. So from that point of view, no question, I could have done more to learn about mental health and anxiety, and therefore potentially what the risks were. But this is one of the reasons why a lot of the work we do in the Jordan Legacy now is around education. Because although we know suicide will not affect everybody, it can impact anybody. And I think that's the thing. In that respect, suicide doesn't discriminate. We know it discriminates towards certain groups and demographics of people in society, particularly those that are impoverished or homeless and struggling. But generally, it doesn't discriminate. It can impact any family, no matter what they're earning, no matter what their background is. And part of our education is to make people aware of this, so that if they have a child, a parent, a brother, sister, loved one, a colleague who they see signs that they're struggling, that they're prepared to be a little bit more human and supportive of them, and be prepared to understand and learn what those difficulties could result in the worst case scenario, but just how to provide and support them, really. So education for me is really, really important. You're more likely to come across somebody with a mental health illness than you are with a physical illness these days. So I just think we need to learn more about this topic as families, as schools, as workplaces, and in society generally.
What are the key things to look for in terms of support for it? How can we better support people that are going through challenges?
I think we need to slow down a bit. I think we need to not judge people for their behaviours. I think it's really interesting. I talked about this in a post recently, that I noticed that, in the first few days and weeks following Jordan's death, where I maybe had to drive somewhere, that I'd be the guy at the traffic lights who didn't set off when they turned green because my head was kind of somewhere else, and someone would be quite rightly honking from behind saying get a move on, and probably getting quite cross because they were late for whatever. That's changed a lot for me, because I instantly will think, well, maybe there's something going on with them today. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And as a prime example of that, I know we were talking off air before we came in today. I'm a keen cyclist, and just over a week ago, a lady approached a roundabout, didn't stop, came straight out and wiped me out on my bike. Left me with a few scrapes and all kinds of things, and quite a shocking experience. And a lot of people have been really surprised, because when I wrote about this, if there's ever an opportunity for a LinkedIn post, I'll do one. And this was it. I talked about how my first concern was for her and the shock that she was in. I did ask her where her head was, by the way, when she approached the roundabout. And a lot of people found that quite refreshing and really interesting. I wouldn't have had that attitude 5 years ago at all. I'd probably be screaming and shouting at her, "What, you nearly killed me. What are you doing?" So I think now it's looking at people's behaviours. What's changed about that person? I could share a whole bunch of things, like they're not sleeping well, they're starting to drink more, they're getting into online gambling, their mood swings, they're more sensitive to criticism, they're displaying signs of physical pain, stomach irritation, or a whole host of things. They're attending Teams meetings, but they're not turning the camera on anymore, or they're just not turning up, or they're more absent from work. You could go a whole list of things that you could look at and go, has this been going on for a period of time, typically longer than a couple of weeks? But for me, it's really simple. Is there a change in that person's behaviour? You can't quite put your finger on what it is, but it's making you think something isn't quite right.
So if I've acknowledged that a friend has changed their behaviour, they're maybe a bit distant, their mood is a bit lower, energy levels are off, how do I best approach that?
Great question. I think firstly, you've got to approach them. Because people go, oh, what if I get this wrong? What if I mess it up? You can't really get it wrong. Okay. It's not about fixing the situation necessarily or anything like that. And most people don't necessarily want you to go in and fix it. They just want you to acknowledge and recognize what they're going through. So I think it is fairly direct. Now, typically our approach would be to go up to someone and say, look, mate, how are you doing? They would come back and say, I'm fine. And we go, okay, that's a relief. I'll go back to work. Because you built yourself up to ask the question because you've got a concern. So one of the first things I say is that you've got to ask twice. And when you ask it the second time, you've got to change the whole intonation and the way you ask it. Because remember, you're asking it because you've seen some signs that are giving you concern. So the second time would be, okay, but look, how are you really doing? And just that change of pace, just the change of the way you ask it, and not letting go with that first answer and walking off increases the chances that person might go, well, okay, why are you asking? Okay, well, look, I've seen this, I've seen that. Just give me a bit of concern. I wanted to check in with you and just see how you're really doing. Or you just say, well, I've seen this and these behaviours and whatever it may be, and, I wanted to check in and see how you're doing. And it's really then about trying to open up that conversation with that individual.
It's peeling it back the layers, isn't it? And I'm sick of the narrative that men just need to talk. In my experience, when I talked about how I was feeling, my partner left. I got pushed out of my job. My friends became distant because I was saying things like, I feel like I'm depressed, I'm extremely anxious, I'm overeating, I'm drinking too much, I'm not really sleeping. Equally, the only time I'm not experiencing pain is when I do go to sleep, although it might only be for 3 hours. Those are the 3 hours that I looked forward to the most because I'm free from pain. And I don't think it's the problem that men aren't speaking. I think it's how people respond when men do speak. And that's the education piece, as far as I'm concerned, that we have to lean into. Because by and large, it is more men that are ending their life than it is than females. It doesn't mean that the attempts are quite high for women as well. Because I understand that, I don't know the exact data around this, but there's still quite a lot of attempted suicides from women. It doesn't mean that they've died by suicide. Whereas men, typically, when they set out to do it, it happens. And
you're right. I mean, 75% of all deaths by suicide in the UK are by men, but actually more women experience depression, more women attempt to take their own lives. And historically, the reason why men have, to use the term, completed the act, if you like, is the means of suicide that they've used, which generally tend to be more violent means. Yeah. We are seeing a shift now in this country, and we've seen a 7% increase in suicide between 2022 and 2023, 8% in women, 5% in men. And what we're seeing is a change in some cases of women using means that men have typically used before. So we are seeing a shift, but right now you're absolutely right. The largest proportion of suicides are men.
Yeah. So I think that not only is it the fact that, we don't know how to respond to it, but I think there's still a huge stigma around talking about it. But in the line of work that you've done so far, what have you been exposed to that is progressing in the right way? If we were to be forward thinking and not focus on the problem, right? How is it developing in a positive way, this space?
Yeah, I think we can be really hopeful. I think we can't necessarily rely on government or national strategies here. I think we'll be waiting forever and a day for change to happen there. But I think we've seen mental health in the media, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, the conversation's really opened up, particularly around men's mental health. That's led to the creation of groups like Andy's Man Club and Talk Club and others that are, doing an amazing job and providing these environments for men to be able to speak. So I think we can be hopeful things are moving in the right direction. Around suicide, we've still got this real stigma and taboo. No one really likes to say the word or have the conversation, but I think we've got more work to do on that. But, when we look at some of the great videos that came out from the likes of Norwich City Football Club.
Fantastic, wasn't it?
And, great experience. That video, if nobody's watched it, the two guys in the stands there, I got to meet the team that created the Norwich City, and they were two just jobbing actors in Norwich, and actually the spectators behind them was the marketing team that produced the video, and they all went for pizza afterwards because they didn't have a budget. But that became one of the most successful videos online. So I think we're seeing a lot of positive change there. I think the narrative is changing, and I hope it's changing slightly around men to recognise that for a long time we believed that men didn't want to talk. That's not true. They will absolutely talk, but they need to be given the right environment for that to happen. Women are, and historically have been, very used to talking about some of the most intimate details of their medical history or whatever, because from a young age, they've been prodded and poked by just about every doctor going through the things that they have to go through, where men haven't so much. They might broke their leg playing football or had an injury of some kind, and even then they might not go to the doctors. But women have been kind of used to that. But also the environment and the networks that women have had historically, usually centered around children, historically as well, have meant that they've been much more open to talk about things that are very personal to them. Men have never had that environment. I'm stereotyping here, but they go to the pub and they talk about football and what's on TV. Okay, that's changing quite a lot, but that's the stereotypical view that we've had, and it's not a million miles away from the truth. But what we know is that if we understand men and recognise that given the right environment, they will talk. What is the right environment? Usually it's a scenario where it's activity-based, interesting enough, whether that's going for a walk, going for a cycle, going to the football match, whatever it would be, where they can talk to their mates without actually sometimes having to look at each other in the eye. It's sometimes this face-to-face, one-to-one contact that men have problems with. Andy's Man Club, you could argue whether you are sitting in a group and talking openly, but you've kind of got this network, brotherhood, if you like, of people around you. So again, it's a safe environment. So I think for men, they tend not to respond as well to that one-to-one kind of therapy, counselling as women might do, but provide the right environment. But definitely anything that's activity-based, whether that's fishing, whatever it would be. We're going to look at Paul Whitehouse and Bob Mortimer on telly, and we know a bit of their history, particularly Bob Mortimer. But that's a great example of two guys larking around fishing, but then having those moments where they feel they can talk about things that are really important to them. If they were just sitting in a room, I don't think you'd get that dynamic, really.
No, because I say this to people that are struggling with intimacy with their partner. You've got too much side-to-side connection. You need more face-to-face connection. But when it's friend-to-friend, especially in a male environment, as you've alluded to there, it's almost too pressurised, isn't it? And the barriers are going to come up as opposed to that. Should we go for a walk, pal? Should we watch the football too? How you doing, mate? Yeah, I'm sound. Sure? Everything all right? Yeah, I mean, not sleeping very well at the minute. Oh, how so? And then it can open up, and what you can peel back just from not sleeping very well, they might not be sleeping well because they're anxious. They're anxious because they're having arguments with their partner. They're having arguments with their partner because they're not having sex. They're not having sex because they've put weight on recently. They've put weight on recently because they're going through struggles at work, and they're only comfort eating on an evening, for example. And that's not far-fetched. That's very real. That's happening every single day. The more open conversations we can have like this, I think the better, because it's only going to progress the situation going forward, right? So talk to me about the Jordan legacy. I love it because, and I don't mean that in the sense that maybe I delivered it, but I just think that to have this approach when going through the pain and everything else, it is going to save lives. I'm sure it already has. And the impact of that one life will reverberate around to so many others without them knowing it, meaning that when you do complete suicide, I mean, I saw some statistics on one of your posts. What were the statistics around that? If for example, if I was to end my life, the impact it would have on people close to me, what was the number of that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, we know there's this ripple effect that is been estimated from a study done out of North America originally, but 135 people are indirectly or directly impacted by each suicide. So that can be from the first responders that turn up, depending on the circumstances. And, I know one of the police officers involved with Jordan's case, was quite deeply affected. He was a guy of a similar age. Then you've got the family, the extended family, the loved ones. You've got colleagues. You've got, the people that I had to go and speak to in the banks or the utilities and tell them what had happened when closing Jordan's account and the impact that had on some of them. The average is 135 people. We know typically it's probably much higher than that. We had 300 people at Jordan's funeral, so you look at that. But we also know there's a risk factor, particularly for those that are bereaved by suicide, and that is that anyone who has lost someone to suicide is at a 63% increased risk of attempting to take their own life as a direct result of that suicide.
Jesus.
So there's a protective factor that is really important. So when we talk about suicide prevention, the obvious thing most people will think about is how do we support someone who's feeling suicidal? That's kind of an intervention rather than suicide prevention in many respects. That's the intervention part of it. The prevention bit goes way further back from what we do with our kids at school and all that. But then you've got postvention. How do you support the person or the people that are left behind? And that could be work colleagues. That could be direct family. What are we doing for them? Because they are at a much higher risk than almost any other demographic.
Yeah, it's frightening. So are you going around the country and around the world, I believe, doing talks around this and spreading awareness that way? Is it you telling your story and is it Q&A? How does it all work with that?
Yeah, it's a mix of things. So when we started the Jordan Legacy in August of 2020, I wasn't really quite sure what that would look like. And what we've found we've done is that we've been very much a mouthpiece for suicide prevention. We've had regular interactions with the government and the Department of Health and Social Care to kind of understand what the government is doing. And but for a lot of the time, it's been about building relationships with others in the suicide prevention space. A lot of content sharing that we do on LinkedIn to raise awareness about these topics and other social media platforms. We launched a radio show a couple of years ago online called Jordan Space, where we'd get guests in, very much this kind of scenario, and talk about their lived experience from domestic abuse to mental health issues to working in construction to all the different topics. So again, there's been a lot of awareness raising that's taken place. The talks, typically I'm invited into companies to speak specifically about what we've been talking about today. How do we spot the signs in the workplace? How do we then support someone who's struggling? So in the main, these are the talks that I'll deliver here. Last year I was invited out to Gibraltar by the Department of Education to speak in schools and to the business networks over there, business federations. So a lot of it has been around this awareness piece. Then in 2023, we've also run 2 live conferences in Harrogate, by the way, called the Hope for Life conference, really inspiring speakers sharing their stories. But in 2023, we started to move down a slightly different direction, and we undertook an action research project. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to go out and interview people that ran national charities, people that worked on the front line of mental health crisis and suicide prevention teams, campaigners, consultants, and a lot of people with lived experience. And we wanted to know what their view was on whether it was possible to significantly reduce the number of suicides that we have in the UK each year. Currently, we lose 6,000 plus men, women and children every single year. And that number hasn't changed in 16 years now until last year, where, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen this increase now. There's also a belief that the numbers are vastly underreported as well. So we undertook this study over several months, and the questions were around education, around workplaces, around communities, around the government, the NHS. But there were 2 overarching questions, and that first one was, do you believe we can significantly reduce the number of suicides in the UK? And if so, how far can we go? And those were the main questions. And out of those interviews that we did face-to-face, most of them 90 minutes plus, the answers to those questions we published in a report in July of 2023. In fact, it was on July the 11th, what would have been Jordan's 38th birthday. Mm-hmm. And we called it Moving Towards a Zero Suicide Society. And what it did was it took all these responses and all these answers to the questions and created a roadmap of a 84-page report to say, if we do this in education, if we do this in the workplace, if we do this in communities, if the government did this, this is how we would get the numbers down. It wasn't our view. It was the view of those that are out there doing this now and in the main succeeding in their own particular areas. And to replicate that as an image, we created a jigsaw puzzle with all the pieces of the puzzle coming together and one missing piece. And that missing piece really represented all the things we don't yet know about suicide prevention, all the solutions that may come from outside of the suicide prevention space, from technology perhaps and other areas. And that's now led us on this journey to explore how we as the Jordan Legacy might facilitate one of the biggest collaborative exercises that we've seen in the UK by creating a national community network, particularly of grassroots charities and community interest companies and individuals. Often, many of them don't get their voices heard. But how can we bring them together in a network to share and learn from each other and provide support for each other in a way that hasn't been done before?
Mm. Not that it's never going to go away and, trying to be negative about it at all. I think that, as you've alluded to there's so many complexities around it that it's not as, again, not easy, but simple to say, this is a certain type of cancer, we need to create the medicine for that, because there's so many branches to this, aren't there? There's so many problem areas around it. Have you, with the people you've spoken to, the research that you've done, with like the suicide letters and notes that people leave, what are some of the commonalities there that people write? Because something I saw on a podcast a while ago said that it was feeling worthless and that they were a burden. Were they showing up quite a bit?
Yeah, I think interestingly, first of all, and this was a surprise to me, that most people don't leave a suicide note at all. The percentage number, I can't remember exactly what the percentage is, but it's relatively low. Jordan did leave a note. And in many respects, his note was summed up, what you've just said. So if we understand and recognise that suicide is complex and there's many reasons why somebody might decide to take their own life, we know that ultimately, whatever those pressures, external pressures quite often are, it leads to two scenarios. One is they reach a point where they feel completely trapped in that. Maybe it's a gambling addiction, alcohol addiction, relationship problem, work issues, whatever it might be. Or it could be a mix of those things. Once they reach a point where they feel trapped, what happens then in the mind is they see no way out of that. So they now reach that stage of what we would call hopelessness. Once they reach that stage, any plans that they've had, and most people will plan a suicide, that's when they're at the highest risk of enacting that plan. Now, we know what Jordan's thought process was now, to a degree, and we know that through his suicide note that he left, just a small A5 notepad, where he said, look, I know how this is going to affect your but he said, this is the only route I can go. I'm trying to remember exactly where. I usually remember this word for word, but he said, this is the only way I can deal with the thoughts that are literally showing me no way out. So we know that's where his thought process was. In the weeks following Jordan's death, as we got his house ready for sale and started decorating it, we went up into the loft and found a box. And in there were a box of possessions from a previous house move. His basketball trophies. He was a keen basketball player as a teenager. Cards, birthday cards that he kept. But in there were notebooks. And there was also notes from the only talking therapy that he undertook shortly after he was diagnosed with clinical anxiety and depression in 2015. So his CBT process. There were notes there. But in the journals, it was quite incredible to read, because he would talk. He was so critical of the decisions that he'd made in life, and coming back to being worthless and not deserving. He was berating himself for the relationships he'd been in, the wrong decisions he felt he'd made, for the career moves that he'd made, for the house choices. The kind of list just went on. It was, I've made a mess of this, I've made a mess of that. So he was just, every time he wrote that down, of course, was re-emphasizing that. And then in a journal entry from May of 2015, we saw for the first time, he said, I've been researching methods of suicide today, and I've discovered this means, but it's not that easy. And you go, wow. So 4.5 years earlier, he was already considering that as an option out.
Yeah, I was in that headspace at one point. I was researching, how do I stop the pain? How do you end your life? And again, we're going back probably 7 years ago, and the answers would come up like you wouldn't believe. And you're like, oh my God, it was so easy to access this information. And luckily now there's, great foundations like yourself. There's another one called Ripple, which is brilliant. I heard the lady that runs that speak a few weeks ago at an event, which was just amazing, the work that they're doing there. And it's quite frightening, the detail it goes into. And, you start thinking about which is the least painful option and all sorts. Because I was at that stage. I thought, I'm a burden and people would be better if I wasn't here. That's what went through my mind.
I think that is, this is definitely one of the common areas that people have reached such a thought process that they believe that people would be better off without them, that they are a burden. We know, as families left behind, that is not right at all, because the impact and the devastation and the ripple effect afterwards is far worse than whatever that person considers themselves in terms of being a burden there. But we understand, again, I'd say we understand, I've got to understand, and you used the word pain, mental pain before, that it is almost impossible for anyone who's not experienced it to recognize the level of mental pain someone must be in, or even physical pain, to reach a point where they say, this is the only option for me. And I suppose if I can think of any analogy, I'd like you to imagine, you putting your hand on a red hot stove. What's the point at which you're going to take it off? That you just cannot keep it on there anymore. That is the level of mental pain that we are probably talking about, because I can't talk about that from experience, only from anecdotal conversations and evidence and research. But that's it. How long could you hold your hand there before you said that's enough? Not very long. Yeah.
My coach said to me a while ago, and this was post the incident where I nearly ended my life, he said, it was around a different subject, but have you had enough pain yet? And I just sat with that question. It kind of dumbfounded me. And I think it's such a, not brutal that he was wrong to ask it, but brutal in the way of going, fuck, have I had enough pain yet? I said, what do you mean? He's like, well, you've said that this is causing you frustration and it's challenging, and it has been for the last 3 months of us working together. So have you had enough pain yet? It's like, shit, yeah, I have. And the next day I sorted my, sorted my life out and started to take back control of it in different ways. And I think for anyone listening, that it's such a brilliant question. It holds up a very big mirror. You don't want to go there, right? Have you had enough pain yet? You're like, well, yeah, of course I have. But they haven't. Some people, their level of pain is that they try on a pair of jeans and they can't fit in them anymore. So they go to the gym and they sort it out. Other people have to be on the operating table, and the surgeon needs to say, if you keep eating this way, you're going to have a heart attack. And still, some people don't change. Some people would rather die than change when it comes to that kind of thing. I love that analogy, metaphor, whatever, about the stove, because that's essentially how it did feel, when I was going through it. It's, right, how long is it till I get to go to bed and try and numb the pain? Oh, I'll have more beer. That'll solve the problem. Pouring a toxic, liquid down my throat. And, abstaining from the alcohol has been a huge part of recovering from those thoughts, as it were, and 4 years alcohol-free now. And it has been massively beneficial for that. But there's something else on the article that I found really interesting. And I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions there is around mental health, that there's a big difference between being severely depressed and feeling depressed. What is that?
Well, again, I'm not a clinician and definitely not an expert in mental health at all, and been fortunate never to have experienced clinical depression. And I think adding the word clinical to it is really important because it is a diagnosed mental health illness according to the World Health Organization. It is the biggest cause of ill health worldwide. Being sad for a few days or feeling depressed, and people will use that word, is something that most people will get through and come out the other side of, maybe even during the course of that day. For someone who is experiencing clinical depression, I've heard it described as being an inability to function and do anything, whether that's getting out of bed, whether it's doing any social activity or work activity. I've heard it once described as you're lying in bed and there's this massive dark cloud above you. You can physically see it there, and it's weighing you down so you cannot move and you cannot get out of bed. It is the most debilitating of illnesses possible. What we know, though, with the right support and the right treatment, that people can get through depression, but we also know that people can live with it for decades, for large periods of their life. But it is, to a large extent, treatable with the right, sometimes medication. It needs to be the right medication. There's a lot of debate around medication at the moment, and Jordan was on an antidepressant at the time, and we have concerns about the latest dose and the timing of it and things like that. And combined with some form of talking therapy rather than one or the other. Usually the most successful recoveries from depression are through a combination of the right medication and talking therapy together.
Someone just phrased it slightly different. They were like, mental health and mental illness are vastly different. And
we've all got mental health.
Exactly.
We've all got mental health. It's just sometimes it's really good, sometimes it's shit.
Correct, yeah. And that's the same with our physical health. It's 2 weeks ago I had the flu. But it happens, I didn't die from it, and you can get past it. And I think using such strong language and strong labels of I'm depressed today, or I'm severely anxious today, or I've always struggled with anxiety. That's a very common one. But they say it's so blanket. I've always struggled with anxiety. And you're like, right, pause a second. You have always, implying it's never been different, struggled with, struggle is a great fight from a restraint, anxiety, like it's an object. Is that true? And they're like, well, maybe not always. Okay, but you said always. So if it's, I always struggled with that, it'll become a belief. It'll become part of who you are. It'll become part of your identity. And what really is happening for most people is they've developed a poor strategy for dealing with moments when they feel anxious. So they might pick at their skin, they might pull at their hair, they might incessantly tap their knee. Then it goes to things more extreme like alcohol to try numb the pain, drugs, smoking, overeating, shouting at their parents or their children or their partner, whatever. Everyone will hit their need in a different way. But there's so many more helpful strategies that can be used. And also, if you're more intentional with your language, and I think it will help enormously. Just saying, you know what, maybe today I'm a bit overwhelmed. Today I'm a bit sad. I'm a bit tired today.
No, I totally agree. I think the self talk, from a young age, is really, really important. I think there's a wonderful book, and I'm going to forget the author's name. Historically, it's a book of some years now. As a Man Thinketh, called, a great little book, and it does say, basically we are who, what we think. There are strategies that can change the way that we think. Some of those require physical actions to undertake to change that mental process. But yeah, I think the way we talk about mental health, and I think there's, I think Matt Haig, the author, I'm a big lover of Matt Haig's books. I've read so many of them now, but, he said until we start to think of mental health in the same way we do physical health, and as one, we're never going to break the stigma. And I think that's why having these conversations, why the education that we do, going out talking openly about mental health, not in a whispered way, but some guy walking out with his mate or playing football or going to the game, whatever it would be, could say, yeah, I'm just not right in the right headspace at the moment. I'm worried about this or I'm worried about that. That's mental health. We don't need to wait for them to say, I think I've got anxiety or depression. It's just, I'm worried about this or I'm concerned about this. That's a thought process. That's your mental health.
Yeah, and equally, if you don't want to talk, that's also okay. You can just sit with your friend and just be. You can just be present, can't you, without having to fill with empty noise.
Yeah, and it's what I said earlier, really, that people don't often want you to go in and fix the situation. Most of us can't anyway. I mean, I'm not a qualified mental health professional, so I can't go in and fix the problem that you've got. But what I can do is listen, and I can be with you and create that space for you to say something or say nothing. And I think that just when people realise they don't need some kind of ology to support a mate, and all they've got to be is there to listen sometimes, then just do that.
Yeah.
That could be the biggest difference you've made to that person, where no one else has given them the time of day or told them to buck themselves up, man up, or whatever other language.
Get on with it. Yeah. It's listen without fixing and listen without judgment, I think, is the ultimate skill that could be taught, worldwide. And we're doing our utmost for it, aren't we, mate? So what's next for you and what's next for the Jordan legacy?
Yeah, well, the big focus at the moment is the rolling out of an initiative called One Voice, One Hope, and that is this collaborative network. We're currently in the process of inviting a number of people I know in my network to a couple of what we're calling framework building exercises, where we're going to look at this network, which will be a physical and online network, to bring people together to collaborate and see what we can do at a real practical level to reduce suicides in society, in education and workplaces. So that's underway. Got a couple of events this month coming up, some more conferences to speak at. I'm speaking at Northumbria Police Safeguarding Conference in the next week. But One Voice, One Hope is our big focus at the moment. And then in the new year, a couple of events in the Harrogate District area around mental health we're running, and just keep doing what we're doing. Really just keep the awareness out there and keep sharing the content, keep spreading the message, and importantly, keep that message of hope, is that if we're all prepared to do all we can to prevent all preventable suicides, if we all have that belief and we're prepared to do something about it, then we can make a difference and we can save more lives. But we've really got to make an effort with our mates, with our kids, with our families, with our work colleagues. We've got to recognise it as a thing that we need to be more cognizant of and learn more about.
I'd happily get involved with anything like that, mate. So thank you so much for sharing that today in your story. Finally, we ask every guest this. What does it mean to you to be on your A game?
Whoa, okay. I think it is, for me, my A game is a feeling where I feel kind of energized and motivated by what I'm doing that day or that week. It's really easy sometimes in the job that I do. And just this weekend, we've had a couple of instances of men particularly that were considering ending their own lives and had to get involved with that and deal with that. And that can be quite challenging and difficult. As always, fundraising for the Jordan Legacy. We're a community interest company, a CIC. We exist purely on donations and goodwill and the talks we deliver and donations there. So that can be a struggle. So a lot of things that can really weigh you down as you're trying to do the very job that you want to do and make the difference. So I think for me is it's when I can see that things are happening, when I get those messages from people that do write to me and say, this is the difference, your help and resources on the website have helped my son or helped somebody. I think I'm on my A game when I know I'm making a difference, and you can't always know that. So it's kind of when people let you know, I then feel like I'm on my A game and we're doing the right thing.
Amazing. So we'll put all your details in the show notes, but where can people find out more?
TheJordanLegacy.com is the website. So you find our mission, our strategy, how you can support us on there, all the latest news and blogs that we write and articles on there as well. And importantly, the help and resources section. We've developed over a period of time now some quite extensive resources for all aspects of mental health and suicide prevention on there for young people and people of all ages as well. So do check that out if you're worried about anybody at all.
Thank you so much for today, mate. And for anyone watching, if you are at home struggling right now, just please remember that help is out there. There's we're going to put a lot more details in the show notes today about the help that you can ask for and the resources that are available. But yeah, Steve, thank you so much for sharing your story today.
No, thank you, Adam. Appreciate the invitation.
Awesome.